Anthropologists, Michael Agar, the late anthropologist, referred to anthropologists as professional strangers. Even though my professional work really didn't have that much to do with Native Americans in the United States, it just sort of took me into another social world. And I think you suddenly are aware of a completely different way of seeing the world, of being in the world, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And I was, like a lot of people of that, of our generation, I was drawn to anthropology because of that.
There he is.
Hi, Mark.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. Is my image okay?
Well, I think it's just lovely. Let's see.
We've been struggling with. It's funny. I've watched some videos, some webinars from other places, and just been blown away. That kind of by the HD quality. It's hard. When you're interviewing people with their home equipment and so on.
Yes, I know this is going to be a new brave world for me as well, because I've done all my interviews from basically in live person.
Right.
Right. So, to me, it's really basically the same. In some respects, it's a little easier because I can keep my water out of the shot, and it's right there easily to get. There we go. I can lean back in my chair.
Right.
Normally, I can't do. And of course, during the pandemic, we have to keep 6 feet apart. So you and I can be 1 foot apart. Doesn't matter because we're 542 miles apart. Which I happen to know, having driven to Santa Fe from Tucson about.
Yeah, it's a haul. It's a haul. How hot did it get yesterday in Tucson?
It was 100, I think, and 12 maybe or 11. But amazingly, the clouds came in, the monsoons kind of came in, and it was nice. I went out and had some fun in the outdoors at 112. But if you don't have any sun bearing down on you, it's just not bad. It's hotter in Santa Fe, I think, with the heat, with the way the clouds are and the way it's 7,000.
Well, it was a little, it got into the high 90s and it was a little uncomfortable, but that's pretty rare for Santa Fe.
That's really hot. Now, how long have you been in Santa Fe?
Hang on, I'm changing my name here.
Okay. Yeah, we're starting, by the way.
Oh, we are? Okay. Well, I just started my 7th year as president of S.A.R, but as I explained in an earlier message, I've had a long history in Santa Fe and New Mexico, going to the Philmont Scout Ranch in 1966.
Let's start back. Yeah, I'd say we start there, Michael. Let's start where you grew up. Now, did you grow up in Kansas? Where did you grow up?
No, I was born in upstate New York. My parents are New Englanders, but my dad was transferred to Dallas in 1964. And then he was in the tire business, worked for Goodyear, and then they transferred him to Kansas City. So I actually graduated from high school in Kansas City, and then went to school in the East. So, but then the New Mexico connection was kind of reactivated because the Tewa anthropologist Alfonso Ortiz, who probably in his time was the most distinguished Native American anthropologist in the United States, was a rookie professor at Princeton University. And I took a class from him. We hit it off. He asked me to be his research assistant, which meant that for the same rate of pay that I was currently getting for like mopping the floors of the freshman commons, I could work for him. And then he invited me and some other students as well who were financial aid students. We were eligible for a federal program called, ironically, Summer in the City, which was mostly intended for working in inner cities, but it also applied to Indian reservations. And so Rough Rock Demonstration School, as it was called then, in Many Farms, Arizona, was looking for summer volunteers. And so I went with several other Princeton students. And so I did 2 summers at Rough Rock School.
And that's just north of Chinle, right?
That's right. It was like deep immersion. And and now it's, with communication and so on, it doesn't sound like that big of a deal. But I ran into a lot of people who didn't speak English. And I felt like I was at the uttermost ends of the earth.
You were very close to the utter ends of the earth, because Kayenta is not that far from there, and that was the most isolated city in America at that time. So how old were you when you were doing that?
Sorry, I was in my I was 19, I guess, the first summer.
And what year would that have been?
Oh, that would have been 1969.
Okay, so let's back it up. I want to find out some things because in 69, that means in 68, you were graduating high school, right?
That's exactly right. Yes.
And were you interested in anthropology or arts or any of that stuff?
I didn't even know what anthropology was. I thought I was going to be an English major.
Okay. So when you graduate from high school in 68, you end up going to Princeton right away?
Princeton. Yeah,
And
I went to
so that's also the time of the Tet Offensive and Vietnam and all that. So tell me a little bit about that experience.
Well, it was a a lively time, and of course, I was a student there during the Cambodia strike, and I guess that was 1970. Yeah, it was. It's hard to describe. I mean, it seems like ancient history now, but the campus was sharply divided. I mean, one of my classmates is Sam Alito, who's now on the Supreme Court. So Sam and I weren't like best buddies. I'm not sure I even knew him when I was there. There were about 800 students in each class at the time. So it was very divided between old school conservative Ivy League types, and they were heavily into recruiting financial aid students and trying to diversify the student body with African American, and interesting, partly because of Alfonso, there was a whole crop of Native American students who recruited and were my classmates or came at about the same time. So Regis Pecos, who you may know,
Who is
he's a very prominent Pueblo intellectual and has worked for the state. He was the head of whatever they call the Indian relations part of the New Mexico state government. He helped to negotiate the change in the entrada during Santa Fe Fiesta, which became very political.
Yeah, I remember.
It's a real tribute to his gifts that he was able to negotiate a solution which seems to be holding pretty well. So, and there were Victor Messias from Hopi was in that group, and there were others many of whom have become very prominent American Indian political officials, lawyers, tribal chairmen, that sort of thing.
Did you know these individuals at that?
Yeah, I knew some of them because I worked for Alfonso. So he
He's
organized.
Santa Clara, right? Alfonso
Sorry?
Santa Clara?
No, San Juan or Okewinge.
Oh, he's San Juan. Okay.
Yeah, but I think he got his BA from the University of New Mexico, then went to the University of Chicago, which at the time was one of the top 3 anthropology programs in the country, was hired by Princeton. And at the time, he had short hair and wore a little tweed jacket and not what he looked like later in life. He won a MacArthur Fellowship, and then he wanted to give his children the opportunity to really be raised as Tewa, or to at least be initiated and be participants in Tewa religious life. So he took a job at the University of New Mexico. So after I graduated, years later, that relationship was kind of renewed when I was living in Santa Fe as a resident scholar at S.A.R. And I got to see a lot of Alfonso. He died fairly young. I think it was 1997 when he passed away, and he was really only in his 50s.
He's the reason that you ended up going that anthropological route, would you say?
I think the experience of being on the Navajo reservation really immersed. And now I don't make any great claims about, suddenly I'm no expert on the Diné people, but for a young person like that to be thrown into this part of the world that was completely different environment, different cultural setting,
sure.
It had a huge impact on me. And I think in a funny way, because my family had moved around a lot. I mean, let's just say that moving to Texas when I was 14 was probably the most profound cultural shock that I'd ever experienced. And that sort of prepared me for, anthropologists, Michael Agar, the late anthropologist, referred to anthropologists as professional strangers, and and it makes a lot of sense.
It does.
Mike was right about that, and so I sort of set the stage. So I did 2 summers at Rough Rock, and then a third summer.
What were you doing there at Rough Rock?
If you can believe it, the first 2 years I was teaching English.
I believe
as far as I was mostly taught by the students. I don't know how much I taught them, but they taught me a lot. And then the third summer was at Rhema, Navajo High School in New Mexico, not too far from Zuni. And it was a similar situation, a little bit more diverse community because it was part of the checkerboard area. So there were
Right.
there were Hispanic people and Mormons and others living in that area. So it was a real education in the diversity of New Mexico culture.
Yeah. What do you think you took from that? Because I have to believe that at 19, you were highly influenced by that moment, that time, seeing the world in a different way, seeing a culture in a different way, seeing people that don't speak English that are maybe even your age. And what was that? There had to be some kind of thing that stuck with you, I think, I would guess from that.
Um, well, certainly it was humbling because I was young and not particularly well educated, and somehow I was supposed to be a teacher. And it gave me a lot of respect for what K through 12 teachers actually do and how
Right.
they do it and so on. And there were just a lot of awkward moments. I remember the first trip I flew into Gallup and got picked up by somebody from Rough Rock School, and I think we drove for 4 hours, and I don't think he said one word the whole time we were driving. And I had to get used to just different rhythms about conversation and sometimes awkwardness, just different rules of being together. And it wasn't that he was hostile. It was just he didn't speak unless he had something he wanted to say.
You might not have spoken much English either.
That's a possibility too.
Yeah.
I don't.
And at 19, you wouldn't have thought of that. You would have thought,
know.
oh, this is a guy, an American, he's picking me up.
So, in the end, even though my professional work really didn't have that much to do with Native Americans in the United States, it just sort of took me into another social world. And it was a time, that was the heyday of Carlos Castaneda and so on. And Alfonso assigned, Castaneda's first book in one of the classes. And I think you suddenly are aware of a completely different way of seeing the world, of being in the world, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And I was, like a lot of people of that, of our generation, I was drawn to anthropology because of that. And what an incredible privilege. I get to document people who at the time, were not often able to document their own world. That's, of course, has changed. There are a lot of indigenous anthropologists now, and it's a much more nuanced conversation, I think, between Anglo and indigenous intellectuals. Much better conversation in some ways, but still it was a great privilege for me to be thrown into that situation. And it was a whole lot better than living at home with my parents. I loved my parents, but at that age I didn't want to be home. I'm not sure they wanted me to be at home.
Well,
And
also it was really starting the height of the Native American craze for jewelry and things.
yeah.
And it was a great time, 68 through 72. So did you have the turquoise beads, the squash blossoms? Did you get any?
I didn't. I was never a very good hippie, I think. Though I did. The funny thing is, and I talk about this in one of my books, I did have a beard, and my hair was somewhat longer I had more hair than I do now. And so when I would go to dances, we went to a lot of dances at Hopi, which again were just profoundly affecting. But when the clowns came out, they would often focus on me as if I were some kind of hippie, which they were kind of struggling with. And I remember being at one dance, I was sitting on the rooftops with some of my Navajo students, and the clowns came up and said, "Hey, Jesus come to, Jesus Christ come down for the Last Supper." And it's a long story, and it ended well, but it was, at least initially, hugely embarrassing. But one thing that Alfonso taught me about Pueblo clowning is that they might make fun of missionaries or anthropologists or Anglos in general, but they wanted people to feel good, because the whole point of this was a home dance, or the Niman Kachina, was not to create bad feelings, but to dispel bad feelings and really invite the blessings of the spirits. And so there was a kind of weird reciprocity where they called me down, and a couple of other people too, and then fed us in the middle of the village in front of hundreds of strangers. And he made me see it not as a fun had been had at my expense, but there was this reciprocal quality to it that made me feel good. Again, it was one of these profoundly moving experiences.
Yeah, I would think that would be excellent for speaking to big crowds later on. You know, you've already been surrounded by the entire village of Hopi making fun of you at 19. You know, how bad can it be on stage, right? You know, you've already experienced
So
it.
there's some truth to that.
I would think there might be. And you're so you're doing that instead of that same summer, 69, we have Woodstock going on. And did you even know Woodstock was going on?
I did, and a friend of mine who later became a rather distinguished mathematician, and we had a 3 or 4 day weekend. It was completely crazy, but consistent with the period. We just started hitchhiking east. I don't think we ever thought we'd get to Woodstock, but that weekend we actually hitchhiked all the way to Taos and had some crazy experiences. Some were frightening, some were uplifting, and we sort of did the complete round trip hitchhiking over 3 or 4 days. And it's a long way from from Rough Rock to to Taos. But we got a sort of interesting profile. We were trying to see Alfonso actually, and as it happened, he wasn't. We got to San Juan Pueblo, as it was called then, and he wasn't. Turned out he was living in Espanola, and by then it was dark. Anyway, it's a long shot.
Yeah, no, we have time. This is long format. So he's not there. Then what do you do?
Well, so we rolled out our sleeping bags. It was a really dark night at the time. We walked a little way. We found the house of his uncle where we thought he was staying. His uncle said, well, sorry, Dr. Ortiz has rented a place in Espanola. And it was obviously too late to get to Espanola. So we rolled out our sleeping bags in what we thought was a completely isolated space a little bit outside the village. And then we woke up, I don't know, about midnight, and there were 2 pickup trucks driving donuts around us full of native guys. And I thought, okay, this is where it ends. And so they said, what are you guys doing here? And we said, we're here to say, and they were very hostile, or they appeared to be hostile. And then they said, when we told them we were here to see Alfonso, they said, oh, Alfonso, you can't sleep here. There are rattlesnakes here. So you come with us. And so they just threw our gear into the back of the truck, and they took us to a house that was under construction. It was kind of a foundation and with some studding and stuff. And it turned out to be the San Juan Pueblo softball team. And suddenly a case of Coors appeared, and conversations ensued. And I remember waking up in the morning, at dawn with one guy like sleeping across my legs, and it was just nuts. And so we packed up our gear and headed back. And so we never actually saw Alfonso, but he used to tell, of course, he heard all about it, and he told that story with embellishments over the years. It became this dramatic story of the terrified Anglo guys, with the San Juan softball team. And he would fill me in. He'd say, oh yeah, they remember that guy Miguel. He would say what happened to him. One of them actually died, I think, in Vietnam. And he would fill us in on the life histories, in subsequent years of what had happened to some of these guys. I wish I remembered all their names, because I'd love to see them. It was a very memorable experience.
And you went from there up to Taos, then we
just sort of went up to Taos and, spent a couple of hours, and then realized it was such a long trip. And of course, when you're hitchhiking, you don't know how long it's going to take.
Right. And you have to go back to work, right?
Yeah, we had to go back to work. So we just sort of turned around and did the whole thing in reverse. It was completely nuts. But
yeah, well, that's what you do when you're 19, right? And 20. You do crazy things like that, thinking you can do it. I remember going to when I had to get to medical school. I was in Pueblo, Colorado, and I waited to the very end to go to St. Pete, and I thought, oh, I can get there. And so I had only 2 days, so I just had to drive straight through. So I did 34 hours straight through from Pueblo to St. Petersburg. And I remember hitting Florida at the border going, I made it. And then realizing, oh my God, I got another 800 miles.
Yeah, Florida's a very long drive.
And I had to be there. I mean, that was the rules. I had a rotation was starting. I had to get there. And,
So wait, so you're an MD? I didn't even know about this part.
Yeah, no, I am a DO. Yeah. I went to Missouri for medical school and U of A for residency and fellowship, and sports medicine doctor. Yeah, that's where the medicine man comes in.
So did you practice? Did you have a long practice?
Yeah, I was a military doctor for 4 years as well, and practiced in Tucson. Yeah, after I did my residency here at the U of A. Yeah, that's where the medicine man comes in.
Yeah. Okay, I didn't know that. Learn something new every day.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you probably thought I was a PhD type. Or maybe you didn't think I was anything. That's the doctor part on the deal. He's a donor. That's all we care about. We don't care about anything else.
No, that's not true.
Well, and you know what? And just to say, we're going to get back in, but being a donor to School for American Research is really, I think, an important thing. And for anybody who's out listening to this podcast or watching it, you know, my wife and I, 20 years ago, we started giving money to this research facility, even when we couldn't afford to do it, quite frankly. And it's really worthy of doing that. We were supposed to do all these podcasts at School for American Research, but because of the pandemic and things, we just felt it wasn't safe. And you know, I can't tell people enough how much they have to go and see this museum when it's open. I don't know. Are you guys open at this point right now?
No, it's a fair question, Mark. But no, I mean, as you know, the Indian Arts Research Center collection is not a exhibits museum, so the spaces are rather confined. And even in normal times, we really can't have groups of more than 17 or 18 going into the vaults. So the campus is closed. I mean, we are very early on. I just never believed that this thing was going to go away by summer, which is what some people were saying. And it certainly hasn't turned out that way. And so we shut the campus down. Well, of course, we had to, as part of the shutdown, we're all mostly working from home. But we made a very quick pivot to online presentations only. And in-person events, I really feel that we'll be doing very little through the rest of 2020. I say that with regret, but you know, our concern is for our staff and for our members and our visitors. And the amazing thing, was how quickly the staff made the pivot. And we had 15 or 20 events. You know, the people had spent months working on field trips, lectures, classes, because we do these non-credit classes. And we could have spent months just mourning the loss of, you know, all that work. But I mean, the staff was amazing. We just turned on a dime and said, okay, we're going electronic. And we had some background in that. So we laid a foundation. But of course, then we're like we're dependent on people's home equipment, on sketchy bandwidth. Because of course, millions of students, K through 12 and college students, were doing everything online. And I'm not sure New Mexico is always as well served as some other parts of the country.
That's an understatement.
So we had some awkward moments. Actually, the one that it sort of gives me nightmares. We were doing our first real webinar using a webinar platform, and like 30 seconds into my introduction, so I'm sitting here exactly like this saying, hello, I'm Michael Brown, welcome to, the conversation. The doorbell rang, and it was FedEx with a package delivered that I absolutely had to sign for. And I had to say, excuse me a second while I get this package at the door. And it's just so mortifying. But it's like live TV. You just have to roll with it.
It is what it is. All right. So I want to get back to you taught out at the reservation for 2 years. Mm-hmm. You get your degree at Princeton?
Yeah, I got a bachelor's degree in anthropology and immediately started graduate school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And again, there was an interesting New Mexico connection because my supervisor for that whole period of my doctorate is Richard Ford, who's an ethnobotanist who worked at Wingate Pueblo, is very close to Alfonso. And I worked in his lab. And even though in the end, my research didn't really build on his expertise because I ended up working in Peru. I couldn't have had a better supervisor. He wasn't one, graduate schools programs are often built on experts who then create these acolytes. They train a whole army of students who help them do their work. And Dick did some of that, but mostly he treated us as independent thinkers, and he wanted us to develop our own career and our own work and our own perspective. And in that sense, he wasn't cloning himself, and I'll forever be grateful for his leadership. And he's retired here in Santa Fe and a member of the School for Advanced Research, so I see him all the time. He's doing rather well.
Otherwise, you would have been dealing with plants.
Well, I dealt with plants, and frankly, when I went to the field, I thought I'd be doing ethnomedicine and ethnobotany, and to some extent I did. But the thing about field work that makes it interesting is that you can have you have to have a hypothesis that you're there to test and a plan. But the other thing is there are just so many uncontrollable factors that you also have to have the self-confidence. If the people you're living with are saying, that's not really very interesting, here's what you should be looking at. You have to have the courage to pivot, to make that kind of turn, that kind of shift, to go where the opportunities lie, and where your hosts are saying, they would value your interest and analytical abilities. And so that's what happened to me. So there was some ethnobotany in my work, my dissertation work, but it was fairly modest.
Yeah, my mom was actually a botanist.
Mm-hmm.
And my father was an entomologist, ichthyologist. So I come from that kind of biology background, so I can understand where you are. And you got the best of it. You have that and anthropology, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah.
And so did you get, what degree did you get in, that was in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, so I've got a PhD in cultural anthropology in 1980. Well, 81 was my degree. I actually started teaching before my dissertation had been completed. So I finished it out in the spring of my first year of teaching. I took a job at Williams College in Western Massachusetts, a small liberal arts college, rather good one. And I taught there for 34 years.
And you went down to Peru, though, to do research as well, right? When did you start doing that?
My first summer as a graduate student, or after my first year, Kent Flannery, he was a very well-known archaeologist, had a project there. And so he and Dick Ford said, Michael, do you want to go to Peru to do ethnobotany? Actually, I was doing flotation, where you're collecting botanical materials for identification in a site. And I said, of course. And so on, May 3rd of 1971, I landed in Peru with a small group from Ann Arbor and with a Peruvian counterpart, Ramiro Matos Mendieta. And we went up to Junín, which is the second largest, the lake at Junín is the second largest lake in Peru, second to Titicaca, and it's about 14,400 feet above sea level. So, the physical adaptation was very challenging. That's high. And actually, to get there, you have to cross a pass that's probably 15.5, something like that.
So you were not feeling well. You had a headache, probably.
Yeah, we all had headaches, and there were periods of, hypoxia, and
it could kill you, actually.
Yeah. But we were all young and reasonably fit.
Doesn't matter. So I taught a high altitude training in medicine in the military with the Marine Corps, and you get at 15,000 feet. If you start having problems, there's only one thing to do, and that's to go down. Yeah, that's right. But again, you're 20 and feel invincible. And so you spent the summer there?
2 summers, actually. But I had some latitude to explore the country too. So I did one short trip to visit another Michigan team that was in a place called Lamas, which is in the Department of San Martin, which is Upper Amazon. And frankly, after 2 summers of living in a place where I could barely breathe and in which it was bitter cold all the time, the Upper Amazon, I just fell in love with it. And so I decided I would work in that area when it actually came time to do my own dissertation work. But for various reasons, not very interesting reasons, I changed my field location when I started that work. I started in 1976 and sort of abandoned one project that I didn't feel was going very well. And I went on this crazy kind of walkabout in northern Peru, and you could do this then. I met somebody who said, "Oh, come to my village. There are all these Indians there that they'd love to have you study them." Uh-huh. And so I thought I'm sure he thought he'd never see me again. And a couple of weeks later, I showed up at his door and said, "Okay, take me there." And I walked into 3 or 4 hours through the jungle with my guide and walked into this village of Awahun people, or as they're called now, Waruna was what they're particularly known as. They're Hivaroan, so they're very closely related to the Shuar or Hivar of Ecuador, southern Ecuador. And as crazy as it may seem, I walked in and we talked, and a couple of them spoke Spanish. And I said, "Can I come and live in your village to study your language and culture?" And to my astonishment, they said, "Yeah, sure." So I went back to Lima. I wrote to my advisors at Michigan. I got some supplies. Like a couple of weeks later, I came back, and they had a little guest house in the middle of the village, and I just set up shop there. Of course, I had to learn. I had studied Quechua, or jungle Quechua, which is a different language. I had to start from scratch with Awahun, which is in some ways a more difficult language. But I just did it, and it was a very good experience, and I'm not sure one that you could have today. And today you'd have to have secured the permission of, formal permission
Sure.
of the Confederation of Villages for you to come, and they'd want to know what your work was about, and all totally legitimate things. But at the time, there was no bureaucracy, there was no process other than
Clearly.
I just kind of made it up, and we got along, and I lived in that village for a year.
Wow.
And then I moved to a different village that was closer to a highway. So I happened to be there at the time when the first road connecting the upper Amazon to the coast, which is, of course, where most of the population is in Peru, had just been completed. Now, road is in quotation marks because it was pretty rough initially, and it would be shut down for days at a time in the rainy season and so on. So one of the things I began to look at was the impact of colonization and the construction of a highway on this people who hadn't been in sustained contact ever.
Wow.
And the Awahun they're kind of like the Lakota of South America. They're very tough, historically warlike, very self-assertive, very confident. Sometimes too confident in their own abilities, but they were not a downtrodden, subordinated community ever. And to this day, they are among the most out front indigenous peoples in Western South America. And in that, I really came to admire. I mean, I really admired about them. And they were funny and smart and interesting and adaptive and adaptable. And so there were bilingual American missionary linguists from the Wycliffe Bible translators that already trained a coterie of Awahun teachers to teach bilingually. So in that sense, it was like Rough Rock School. It sort of followed that model.
Mm-hmm.
It was not, forget your own language. This is going to be in Spanish. And so even to this day, I think they have a very high rate of bilingualism. And Awahun is still spoken on a regular basis, and it's now they're literate in their own language as well as Spanish. They have one of the highest literacy rates of indigenous people in Peru, or even in Western South America in general.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I do think, and it's funny, when I was there, of course, like a lot of anthropologists, I was hugely hostile to American missionary work. And there's no question that the missionaries were there to essentially destroy native religion and replace it with evangelical Christianity, or to replace it, maybe is a more generous way of talking about it. But, after 30, 40 years, I've come to think that negative impact was offset by literacy. So they created a whole generation, multiple generations of Awahun people who were not intimidated by writing, who had the linguistic skills to confront and challenge the government or other peoples who wanted to take away their land or otherwise intimidate them. So in that sense, I think looking at the long view, and the funny thing is that there is a significant rate of religious conversion to the Awahun, of the Awahun to evangelical Christianity. But by the 1980s, by the mid 80s, they got tired of kind of being subject to a Christian denomination based in Kansas. And so they broke with them and they created their own Awahun evangelical community. So it's a kind of indigenized Christianity, and that's just typical of them. They just don't like taking orders from anybody. They sure as heck didn't take orders from me, and I wasn't in a position to give them orders.
What was your big takeaway? And I don't mean from an anthropological point. I mean from a Michael point, a spiritual point from you for 2 years doing that.
Well, one thing is, again, it's another case of being humbling. I mean, confronted by a very sophisticated language, the knowledge that the community had. I mean, this is a cliche, but it's just true. I mean, the knowledge that Oahuan people, including young people, had of their environment in which they lived. That 600 bird species. I don't even know how many plant species, thousands, and their ability to identify and use them and live in that live successfully and have a decent diet in that environment is just amazing. And their toughness and resilience in adapting to these challenges, epidemic diseases, illegal logging, violent attempts by colonists to take their land.
Mm-hmm. Did you see those kind of things and fighting and real political
I didn't
strife?
personally, no. I mean, there also was a lot of intra-community violence. That's the dark side of their self-assertiveness. I mean, it was a warrior culture, and a lot of their and tremendous fear of sorcery. And in that sense, I think, the missionaries were trying to convince them not to believe in sorcery, but that's the sorcery is the last thing to go. And even the Christian converts believed that there were witches out there. The only change was, instead of just assassinating them, which was done at a very high rate, even in the early, even at a very high rate before I got there, but had declined significantly, but still took place during the 70s when I was doing a lot of this work. They now just banish them from the community. And frankly, I went there, sort of in awe of Castaneda and this notion that I wanted to apprentice myself to a shaman. And, but I also began to see, in fact, probably the most reference thing I ever wrote was a very short piece I wrote in Natural History called Dark Side of the Shaman. I wrote it in Santa Fe, where it was the heyday. This would have been the late 80s, when everybody in Santa Fe wanted to be a kind of a shaman. And I said, you don't realize that, that they were supposed to be, people thought of shamans as like, I don't know, tree hugging Dalai Lamas or something like that. But shamans are warriors, and a lot of shamanic power is about killing people as well as healing people. And so I began to actually have, I tried to present a more accurate view of what it actually meant to the people I was living with. I'm not saying every society thinks of shamanic work that way, but a lot of them do, more than the sort of New Agers in Santa Fe were willing to acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, it's power, right? I mean, power corrupts, right?
So the shaman in the village, in the second village I lived in, was probably the preeminent shaman of the region. He declined to let me apprentice myself to him, but I went to a lot of his healing sessions. They involved ayahuasca and other use of ayahuasca and other hallucinogens, which were only taken by him, by the way. It was not appropriate for me to take ayahuasca within that framework. But he was involved in an assassination of an accused witch, a hidden shaman, early in my field work. And so the community was on a war footing because the family of the murdered accused witch, he had a target on his back, and he never left his house without a weapon. And it affected the whole village the whole time I lived there. I mean, I wasn't worried about being personally attacked, but a lot of the homicidal raids would occur at night and in the dark, and they may not know who they were shooting at. So in that sense, I had to be careful of where I went and when, with whom. He was eventually murdered after I left the field. And
there was no law and order, I take it. I mean, the law and order was the tribe.
Yeah, I mean, the police could get involved in these things, but they had no way of. I mean, the police work at the time was so crude. They'd end up arresting 5 of the wrong people, and they just really had no way of getting to the bottom of these cases.
And so, from a anthropological standpoint, what was the takeaway from the dissertation?
Well, actually, the book, the dissertation, which became my first book, was called Sewa's Gift, was about magic and about how, anyway, it had to do with the debate at the time of whether magic had a kind of empirical dimension or whether it was really all about language. And I was sort of arguing against the grain of the time that, in fact, a lot of their magic was based on deep knowledge of the environment, which didn't mean that necessarily everything they did was effective in the straightforward empirical sense, but it certainly was part of an experimental attitude towards the world. So people would try plants that they felt had magical powers, and if it didn't have the effect, they just would sort of throw it away and move on to something else. It wasn't like they accepted everything on faith. I was really struck by their kind of, and if you think about it, how could people in the absence of writing and anything like scientific technology acquire this astonishing knowledge of plants and animals without a kind of experimental attitude?
Right,
At the time, there was this thinking that people just accepted this stuff on faith. And I just felt that a lot of that was untrue.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and if you take ayahuasca, I mean, you're going to see some things that'll change your world, I'm sure.
Right, but how did they discover ayahuasca in the first place?
They just tried it,
Yeah,
right?
but that says a lot. I mean, and this is not just ayahuasca. There are admixtures, there are plants that are mixed in with it. There are DMT-based plants and other things like psychotria. I mean, and that's just sort of in the psychotropic side of things. What about other kinds of illnesses?
Oh, yeah.
You have to have a deep engagement. Well, curare, I mean, they were masters of creating dart poison. Well, that's kind of counterintuitive. How would somebody have ever discovered that a particular kind of sap that was treated a particular way would have this effect of numbing or paralyzing gain?
But I think if you're a very observant human being, and I think if you're a shaman, you're going to be that. You're going to be very observant of human behavior, animal behavior. You're going to watch and you're going to see things. Yeah. And you might see something that an animal, gets into a curare, plant and keels over and go, what's that?
Right.
I would think that would be the way. It's not just we'll try it and do it, but I think, they're the scientists of their culture, I would think.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in a weird kind of way, it seemed to me that the anthropological theory of the time didn't really come to grips with that. And so that was my focus. So, and I went back, after finishing my dissertation, I went back several summers in the 80s, but by the late 80s, the Shining Path Insurgency and also a different left-wing group, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, was just making the situation in the rainforest, well, through the whole country, but especially in eastern Peru, too dangerous, not just for me personally, but people I visited. If it was thought that, I look like, I don't know how many times I was accused of being an agent for the CIA. I kind of thought I should get a salary from the CIA because everybody thought I was working for the CIA.
Right.
And so I worried that that the people who were my hosts might be in danger after I left. So I did one interview at gunpoint in Lima in, 1989 or thereabouts. And I said, I love anthropology, but I'm not quite prepared to die for it.
And what does that mean, you at gunpoint?
Well, again, a long shaggy dog story, but I did some consulting for the World Bank. So they had a program called the Tribal Peoples Policy, and they hired anthropologists with local knowledge like me to see whether the government was complying with policies that were supposed to make sure that Native communities, that their rights were protected, that they gained access to resources for agricultural extension or bank loans or whatever else was available to other people in the project area. Mm-hmm. And so on one of these trips to a different part of Peru, I ran into an Argentine anthropologist named Eduardo Fernandez. And after talking business, I was looking for a new project. I'd finished my dissertation-based book. I wanted to do something different and kind of out there. And so he told me this amazing story about from the 1960s about a black intellectual named Guillermo Lobaton was his name, trained at the Sorbonne, of Haitian origin, because there's significant African population in the coast of Peru, and he joined up with a revolutionary group in the 60s and went into a different part of the upper Amazon, populated by the Ashaninka people, who are a Kampa speaking, speak a totally different language from the Awahun. They were known as Kampas historically, but they call themselves Ashaninka. And they treated him as a messiah. So he thought they were becoming Marxists, but in fact they saw him as a kind of messianic figure who could deliver them from the oppression of white people. And it just had this fantastic narrative dimension. And so Eduardo and I decided to work together on this project, and it eventually became a book called War of Shadows that was published in 1991. It was co-authored by both of us. Eduardo now is an American citizen and lives in Maryland. He's doing very well. So it was a great partnership. But part of it, sorry, this story, there's like wheels within wheels here. There was a part of the story was a renegade American missionary kid whose parents were involved with the Wycliffe Bible translators, but he kind of went native. His name was David Pent. And so I was interviewing, my intention was to meet with his widow, because he was disappeared by the Peruvian military in around 1964. And his fate is still undetermined, but it's presumed that he was killed and dumped out over the jungle like many other leftists of the time. But this woman's the new husband was, let's just say, engaged in some kind of activities that made him very security conscious. So I made an appointment with her, and I went to downtown Lima, right in the middle of town at the time, but and they let me in, and he was holding this 44 Magnum and became very hostile, wanted to see my passport. He said I was police. At some point in the conversation, I noticed that in the next room, a guy was loading bricks of $100 bills into a suitcase. So this was the heyday of the cocaine trade. Yeah. I actually think he was not directly involved in the trade. I think he was in the money trade, because apparently there's something like $6 million of American dollars coming into Peru every week, and it had to be sent, had to be converted into the local currency. And at some point he said, I bet you wonder what's going on in that room. And I said, no, actually, I'm not interested in that at all. So it worked okay in the end. He decided I was okay, and he let me meet his wife. And I did a very quick interview of her. And then I hustled my bustle out of there, and I said, okay, and Eduardo, meanwhile, was in much more difficult circumstances in the jungle, working for a Swiss development group, and they were constantly being raided by leftists. Their vehicles were taken. We were supposed to meet in the airport in Pucallpa. The town where we were going to meet was being mortared at night. And so, yeah, we did manage to finish the project, and it was one of my favorite projects ever, because it's just a story. It's a kind of a wild narrative with renegade Americans and the CIA, and we did some incredible interviews.
I bet you didn't see that coming as an anthropology student, that this is where your life was headed.
So I decided, so at the time, Eduardo didn't speak that much English. So our agreement was, and he had, there were hundreds of pages of interviews that he'd conducted in Spanish or in Ashaninka. And so we decided that I would be senior author for the American edition. And when we eventually did a Spanish edition, we would flip the authorship, and, it'd be Fernandez and Brown, which is what eventually happened. But I was working on that book in Santa Fe as a scholar at S.A.R. and thinking, I'm not sure I want to go back to Peru right now. And then I got interested in the New Age movement and ended up doing a whole other project related to that.
Which was related to being in Santa Fe?
Yes, absolutely. Though a lot of the field work, some of the field work was done in Santa Fe. So I wrote a book about channelers. Yeah. But some of the work was done in New England, in the Northeast, in the Mid-South. I think I did a trip or two to California, Arizona, went to Sedona.
Oh, yeah. Just mid-90s? When was this?
Yeah, well, early 90s. I'm sorry. No, that's right. It was early 90s. The book was published in 97.
Yeah. What
but it
was
was
the title
it
of
was a
that book?
really it was a fun project. It was really
What's that book's title?
it's called The Channeling Zone: American Spirituality in an Anxious Age.
Is it
And
still available out there?
it absolutely, yeah, yeah. It isn't. It was published by Harvard University Press, as were my subsequent books. I had a great editor there. That I didn't get to pick the title. Here's a story of the time. So it was a trade book in the sense that it was intended for a general audience. Their editor or their marketing person went to the editor of the New York Times Book Review, which at the time, you absolutely had to get a review in if you wanted to sell a lot of books.
Right.
And she said to him, might you publish or might you review a book if it had the words New Age in the title? And he said, no, absolutely not. Wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So they wouldn't allow me to have New Age in the subtitle or the main title. And anyway, it was what it was. And I still think the title was kind of a mistake, but the book was the book, and it was a lot of fun, and it was short, but was what kind of confounded some of. So at the time, I mean, just to contextualize things, there were two kind of books about the New Age. There's the book of the, I was a skeptic, but I was won over, or a kind of Shirley MacLaine,
Right.
Oh my gosh, this changed my life. So there were the books of the true believers, and then there were books by critics which just said this is ridiculous, this is like, people, their minds became so open that their brains fell out, and so there these really snarky books. And I didn't want to write that. For one thing, I liked a lot of the people that I was interviewing. I thought they were sincere. I didn't always buy their stories, but the job of an anthropologist, it seemed to me that my obligation was to be just as respectful of the spiritual journey of my fellow Americans as it was to be respectful of the spiritual life of the Awahun or the Hopi or whoever anthropologists write about. Why should we just have a license to be snarky about our own people and not give them the same, not treat them with the same decency, which doesn't necessarily mean that the book was completely uncritical or anything. It was just I tried to make it as balanced as possible. Some of the Times did review it, but the reviewer was somebody who just hated the
Concept.
Yeah, the concept and the people I was writing about. And so
For those people who might not know what New Age means, why don't you just let our audience know?
Well, I sometimes call the metaphysical movement. It's kind of an improvisational spirituality that still is a factor, but I don't think it's quite as it's dominant in Santa Fe as it was in the 80s and 90s. So some cases involved the appropriation of Native American religion. And one of the reasons I went to channeling was because I didn't feel that I could be objective or sympathetic to people doing medicine wheel rituals, or, I don't even sweat lodges that they had no business really appropriating. But the thing about channeling is it's really just another form of spiritualism that has a long European history. They did spiritualist rituals in the Lincoln White House, I'm told.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah. So I felt, okay, I could live with that. Now, there were some people who channeled Native Americans or claimed to channel entities who were American Indians and so on. But in general, it seemed to be had a strong history in the West. And so I don't know, I had a blast, and I went to a how to channel workshop, and I guess in my own kind of, uptight way, I opened myself to the intuition in a way that I had a certain respect for, or at least, I guess, what I found was that there was something characteristically American about it, in that people felt free to just try out different types of spirituality. And many of them said to me, if this doesn't work for you, or it didn't work for me, I tried this for a while, I decided it just wasn't right, I moved on to something else.
That is an American way right there, for sure.
Yeah, sometimes dismissed as spiritual shopping, but Americans have been doing that for a really long time. You think about, it goes back to the 19th century. And so I felt that I could be fair-minded about it, and I think that I was. So I was sometimes criticized for not being nasty enough about some of these things. But it wasn't the book, and I had a great editor. The book wasn't about me; it's about the people who shared their experience with me. And I tried to be true to that. And it is true that I did not work with any, I mean, there were some, the whole question of cults was also a hot topic at the time. And I didn't work with, there were a handful of channelers who had, let's just say, cult-like followings and, exercised a kind of somewhat authoritarian power over their believers. And I didn't happen to work with anybody like that. And
The Jim Jones types.
well, I'm not going to mention names, but well, Jim Jones, I mean, that's the most extreme version. But there were some channelers who had national reputations and followers, and money flowed in their direction. And I worked with a lot of, I had a couple of name channelers who I interviewed or went to sessions led by, but in general, it was kind of down-home stuff. It was like half a dozen people sitting around a kitchen table with cups of coffee while somebody channeled a spiritual entity. And I wanted to understand why that was meaningful to them. People were so nice. I had a ball. I didn't have to worry about getting malaria. I didn't have to worry about it. Or somebody shooting me. And
this was done in Santa Fe and it was,
it was started in Santa Fe because while I was writing War of Shadows with Eduardo, who came to visit a couple of times, I just kept running into people doing this kind of work. And I looked around, I didn't feel that people were writing about it, that academics were writing about it in a fair-minded way. It was just this very hostile, condescending way. I didn't feel that I felt there was a space in this for a kind of fair-minded, I called it sympathetic skepticism or skeptical sympathy, maybe is a different way of putting it. And even some of my, some of the people, I think a lot of the people I interviewed felt that I was on my own personal spiritual quest.
Well, maybe you were in some respect, you think?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I learned some things.
I don't know how you can write about that if you don't have interest, to see both sides of the story. I mean, that's what I would think.
Yeah. I mean, there were some weird moments, but in general, it was kind of fun. And the book was reasonably successful. It's still in print, and but it also was trying both War of Shadows and the Channeling Zone were me experimenting with a different kind of writing, a much more accessible kind of writing. Because I was teaching at a small liberal arts college, and the big dogs in my field were at Berkeley and Harvard and Texas and Oxford and Cambridge, and I realized, I'm not at that kind of place, and I'm not even sure I could do that. I wanted to try a more accessible kind of writing, more not popular, but then that funny space is sort of,
I get it.
Well, it's called academic trade. It's published. There were 3 books published by Harvard, but so they're high standards. But they wanted to sell books too, and so I apprenticed myself to this brilliant woman who taught me how to abandon all the writing tics of graduate school and write in a different kind of way. And it was one of the best experiences of my career.
And are you still writing books?
Well, not so much since I've been at S.A.R. because it's more than a full-time job, and it's an institution that I love. And I've written a few things, and I just did a foreword for somebody's book, and of course I write tons of stuff for S.A.R. So,
yes.
When this job is done, then I hope to get back and do a couple of projects as a writer. But for now, I'm 110% at S.A.R.
So you finish your book, this New Age book, and then go back and you teach, right? You're teaching in Massachusetts.
Yes, absolutely. And it was an undergraduate institution, so I didn't have graduate students. But Williams was pretty liberal about sabbaticals, and so I would take every leave that I was entitled to. And actually doing the New Age book, I got interested in the whole question of the appropriation of Native American religion. And on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to the native critiques of white people who, take their knowledge and commercialize it and so on. On the other hand, it's kind of weird if you think about it to say, as people would say, someone's stealing our religion. Because, of course, most Western religions or most world religions are proselytized. They want other people, to take to embrace their religion. And so I decided to start exploring that. And it was a similar case where I didn't feel the debate was sufficiently nuanced. And so I wrote a book called Who Owns Native Culture? That's probably the most successful book, not universally loved for reasons that I can explain, but in terms of just sales and resilience, because it still sells pretty well. It's used in law schools and it's used in museum studies programs, Native American studies, anthropology. And appropriation is the debate about it continues. If I were writing the book today, because it was published in 2003, I would do certain things differently, obviously, because the world changes and my thinking has changes. And I have to say that living in the Southwest, having Native staff, having Native scholars, and especially Pueblo people and their concerns about cultural privacy, has changed my feelings to some extent about it. I would do some things differently.
Like what kind of things would you do differently?
Well,
I know it's a tough question, but this is a tough show.
Yeah, I guess. Well, so the problem is that a lot of the sort of advocacy against, or the activism against cultural appropriation, mounts a critique, and in some cases a very powerful and compelling critique, but they don't offer solutions. So, people will talk about a cultural copyright, but then if you really start playing that out, first of all, it's in many ways, it's totally inconsistent with what copyright is. Copyright is a time-limited right to copy.
Right.
So now, admittedly, copyright itself it keeps getting extended. Every time Mickey Mouse's copyright is about ready to expire, by some miracle, the Congress extends it, right? But patents are now up to 20 years. But the whole idea is that you're given a time-limited monopoly to benefit as an individual or an organization from some creativity on your part. And then it drops into the public domain. Then it's turned over to the public to be used for whatever purpose they want. Of course, Native people don't want it. They say our culture is eternal. It's not, it's not 75 years or it's not 20 years. So they want a kind of permanent control over the knowledge. But then you get into questions like, how do you define? So you can see behind me a 2 Gray Hills rug that was actually purchased from Medicine Man Gallery. Thank you very much. It's a small one.
I love it.
And so clearly, if a commercial company took that design, which was the creation of a particular weaver, and produced 1,000 versions of it, that's clearly a violation of copyright law.
Right.
But all it takes is a few tweaks, because the standards of originality in copyright are fairly low. So the question of what constitutes a Navajo rug gets to be pretty murky. And it also begs the question of who invented, Navajo rugs are themselves a historical accretion of wool from Spanish colonists, and weaving techniques that probably came from the Pueblo people that were appropriated or learned by Navajo people, and designs that in some cases, as you know way better than I do, were actually encouraged or suggested by early traders who knew what the markets were like in the Northeast. Now, that's not to say that there isn't tremendous creativity and artistry in Navajo weaving. I'm a huge fan of. But the question is, how do you copyright the Navajo rug?
Right.
Not specific rugs, which actually are protected by current law, but the whole notion of
the image, the sensibility of what it is.
Yeah, so on this side of me, you can see a weaving from Peru, a perfectly ordinary manta that I picked up in a market, 40 years ago. Is that radically different from Mexican weaving or from certain American Indian weaving? And what about what about exchanges between tribal groups, of which there are more than I can even begin to document? It's a moving target. Right. And so one of the problems with copyright and patent is that it kind of rigidly defines things and freezes them in time, and denies the fact that Native peoples are incredibly creative and are inventive and are constantly changing their traditions. So the book kind of talks about some of the complexities of those things and proposes others, non-legalistic solutions to cultural appropriation, which I totally recognize as a problem and it is an injustice. That's not really at issue. It's okay. What do you do about it?
Well, you have one of those situations in S.A.R. too, right? The Zia jar from the Zia symbol, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
well, that was repatriated, so some years ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I actually talk about the Zia case, the Zia sun symbol case. Interviewed the then tribal chairman at Zia Pueblo, and that was an example. On the one hand, this Zia sun symbol was appropriated for the state flag of New Mexico, and by virtue of being the state flag, is on every license plate and letterhead, and I don't know, rented potties and
Southwest Airlines.
Yes, well, but the Southwest Airlines case was interesting because Southwest actually approached the Pueblo and said, we would like to use that symbol on our airplane. What do we have to do for you to support that? Right. And so money, I'm told, was deposited into the Tribal Fellowship Fund. And so in the end, it was not about monetary relations or ownership. It was about respect. It was just about basic relations of respect. We just simply wanted to be asked because this is a key symbol for us. And so, that it's a very elusive topic because you say copyright and people think it's all about money. But for a lot of Native peoples, there are financial implications of this and they have to be respected and explored. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it's just about respect. Why is it that you can steal our stuff and not even ask us?
Right.
And so I try to capture that in the book.
When did they repatriate that jar? Do you know?
It was well before my time, I want to say. But here's an interesting example. I think it was in the 90s, though I'm not 100% sure about that, Mark. But I wanted to use, for the book, a photograph. It was actually a Gilpin photograph, if I'm not mistaken, of the pot and the flag together. But in a book about cultural appropriation, I didn't feel that I could, and I had I secured permission from the Museum of New Mexico because it came from the archives to publish the picture, but I felt that I had to reach out to Zia.
Right.
Because it would be like totally hypocritical to do this whole thing about cultural appropriation and then appropriate this image without their permission. But at the same time, I couldn't wait years for the Pueblo to go through his whatever deliberations. So I just sent a letter to the Pueblo with a photocopy of the picture saying, I would like to use this photograph. If I hear from you in the next 90 days that you do not want that picture to be published, I will not publish it. If I don't hear from you in 90 days, I will assume that constitutes permission. And I didn't hear from them, and I've never had any blowback from the Pueblo. So my feeling was they just want to be asked and informed. And believe me, if the tribal government had immediately said absolutely not, under no way, then I wouldn't have used that photograph.
Yeah. Well, that's a great example of, and I didn't know it was on the cover of your book, but that's.
Well, it wasn't in the cover, but it's in the book.
In the book, yeah. Now I've got to read this book. So give us the name of the book again.
The title is just Who Owns Native Culture?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
It's published by Harvard University Press, and you can get it, at Amazon for $25 or something like that.
Well, I'm not sure it's ever been more significant than this time right now that we're going through with, all the cultural monuments and the things that we're saying, who owns this, what's that, and this is that dialogue that you were having back in 2003 is when you published this.
That's right. But one thing I want, and this has come out, Pueblo people, my sense is, again, I'm not an expert, but they have very strong feelings about the distribution of knowledge, both within their society and between societies. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think, somewhat unique to Puebloan societies. It has to do with the way their religion is put together and the colonial history of their relations with the outside world. And similar things are found among Australian Aboriginal people too, very proprietary, very secretive, very private knowledge. But sometimes in the context of Santa Fe, I have to say, I understand that, I respect it. I don't violate those rules. When I go to Pueblo rituals, I don't ask questions. I only will take whatever information people are willing to offer. But there are many other indigenous peoples in the world whose attitude is very different, and they want their stories to be told, and they're proud of their stories, and they have no cultural, what's the word, restrictions on the circulation of those stories. And so there's a funny way in which the Southwest, the unique cultural circumstances of the Southwest are sometimes projected onto indigenous people elsewhere, and it's not always accurate.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about the School for American Research and its mission, because it's unique, I think, in what it's trying to do.
Yes, it is. It is. So and the name thing is complicated. So the school was founded in 1907. We're in our 113th year as the School of American Archaeology. And this was at a time when archaeology was a newly emerging discipline. It wasn't represented in colleges and universities. And also at a time when some Americans, educated Americans, were kind of sick of always kowtowing to, Roman and Greek and European prehistory, and felt that the United States had its own cultural history and prehistory or pre-contact history that was worth understanding. And so they really wanted to create at the School of American Archaeology a center for scientifically based work on the history and cultures of the United States. And it was very successful, and archaeologists at the School of American Archaeology, as it was called, were involved in almost all the most important archaeological projects in New Mexico and Arizona, Chaco Canyon, Bandelier National Monument, which is actually named after one of them, Adolphe Bandelier, and many other equally important archaeological sites. But by the 30s, archaeology had kind of arrived, and so universities had departments of archaeology, and in a way, I think the mission of S.A.R. was somewhat, and Santa Fe was a pretty remote and obscure place at the time. So the organization changed its name to the School of American Research, which reflected a broadening of its mission to include the culture, histories, not just pre-contact cultures, but contemporary cultures of especially indigenous peoples, Athabascan and Puebloan peoples of the Southwest. And then in 1967, but the institution was on kind of shaky ground. Its office was downtown in Santa Fe. It came into, in 1922, the collection of Southwestern pottery and later of Navajo rugs and baskets, and as well as two-dimensional art drawings, which will celebrate its centennial in 2022, and eventually became the collection of the Indian Arts Research Center, the IARC, at S.A.R. So it's a very New Mexican history of a founding that then morphed in various ways over time. Douglas Schwartz was made the president in 1967 at a time when S.A.R. was kind of on the edge of the abyss, I think, in terms of its financial stability. Mm-hmm. And Doug, you may have known, was a very charismatic archaeologist, Yale-trained archaeologist, and he just brought the place to life and enlisted the kind of support, financial and otherwise, that it needed to grow. And in 1972, one of the board members, Amelia White, passed away and bequeathed her estate on the east side of Santa Fe to S.A.R. So the present-day campus of S.A.R. was inherited in 1972. It's one of the most historically significant examples of Neo-Pueblo architecture in Santa Fe. It's funny how few people actually know of the campus. It's partly because there's a wall, and most of the historic campus is in an arroyo, so you can't really see it from the road. You can't see very much from the road. But Doug then created most of the programs that we have today. So there's an advanced seminar program where you bring 10 academics together in essentially the seminar house, which is almost like a B&B, and ultimately these conferences 5, 6 day conferences were turned into books. We've now got more than 250 of them in print. And they were hugely influential in Southwestern archaeology, especially about Chaco Canyon, but also the Maya research. Jerry Sablov, who's on our board, was the co-editor of one of those, or editor or co-editor of one of the first books that began to revolutionize thinking about the Maya. And that seminar program has gone on for years. And then there's shorter seminars that we do. And also Doug created the resident scholar program. So we currently typically have 6 scholars who come for 9 months. And if I think of those, something like 17 of them have been named, have won the MacArthur Genius Award.
Wow.
And so they've become very influential. So in the scholarly area, S.A.R. has more of a national or even international reputation. But Indian arts itself was a pretty quiet place, but it's now essentially focused entirely on breaking down the barrier between the communities of origin of the collection and the collection itself. So it's right out in front of efforts to bring the descendants of the artists whose collections we hold into the conversation about what these things mean, what kind of information should be in the public domain, what kind of information should never be in the public domain, and held by them about their artwork. Works that do have religious or profound cultural significance have already been repatriated, and we do have some ongoing repatriation conversations, but the IARC itself has never had human remains, so that was just not something that they had to deal with. And then since my arrival in 2014, we focused a lot on our public program. So we're a membership organization. The members provide their memberships, which range from very inexpensive, say $50 a year, to considerably more. At our President's Circle or Founder Society could be as much as $5,000 a year, which is a philanthropic contribution of great importance to us. And so one of the things that I've changed is broadening the scope of our public lectures. Historically, many of them, not all of them, but many of them focused on Southwestern archaeology. But Southwest Seminars in Santa Fe, which I'm sure you know about, already runs a very successful program. They have 50 lectures a year, many of which are focused on Southwestern archaeology. They do a great job. And so coming in, I thought, well, it seems to me there was a niche for other kinds of conversations too. And so we broadened the base. We still represent Southwest archaeology. I think we just had Seb Powell do a very well attended webinar on Southwestern rock art, Pueblo rock art. But we've got speakers who've talked about artificial intelligence and the impact that it's going to have. We had a woman, just a brilliant woman, Harvard trained woman, come and talk about what biochemistry is doing now to create new medicines using new genetic technologies. And so we've reeled in people who maybe aren't that interested in Southwestern archaeology, but are interested, I love our members because they have this free-form curiosity, this desire to learn about the world, and bringing smart people to town to talk to them enriches their lives. And that's really what we're doing right now on the public program side. So at the point of the centennial in 2007, again, 7 years before I came on board, the decision was made to change the name from the School of American Research to the School for Advanced Research to reflect the broadening of the mission, which started before my time, but which I've tried to accelerate and extend. And frankly, Mark, for the first couple months in the job, I was inclined to call it the School of American Research because that's what it was called when I was there as a scholar. But I've learned that we're the School for Advanced Research. And in a way, it's just, we've been S.A.R. throughout. So that's hard. That's
well, U of A is now no longer the U of A, it's UA.
Is that right?
I don't know why. Yeah.
These things change.
But I understand your change. I mean, I get that for advanced research because it's not just one small area. You're trying to broaden your base, broaden, the curiosity. And you also have the Dubin Fellowship, which I think is really.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. We also have a long history of supporting Native artists. We have 3 endowed Native Artist Fellowships every year, and we have the Dubin Studio where they can work. And it's if you look at the roster of Native American Artist Fellows, it's kind of a who's who of, many of these people came when they were young, and this was a way to really throw themselves into their production. And now they're very well known. It's one of the things that I'm proudest of, and I think we're known for. So we, membership has gone up dramatically in the last 5 years. I mean, right now the pandemic has kind of flattened that curve.
Yeah, that's the only curve we managed to flatten, right?
I think we had 550 members when I came, and we're now over 800. And one of the things that by going electronic, we've really broadened the scope. We're engaging people from outside of northern New Mexico, and we're going to keep doing that because it's really important that we, bring more people into the fold.
And if people want to become a member, how do they do that?
Well, just go to our website, sarweb.org, and just go to the membership link. And one of the things that we've done, again, there's a special kind of pandemic page that shows you all the events that we're doing. So one of the things we want to make clear is that we may be closed to the public in terms of our space, but we are open for business, and we're getting just tremendous uptake on our events. They're different sorts. Some of them are some of them are kind of small and intimate, 20 people on Zoom, but we're now using a webinar platform and getting bigger crowds. And they're different scales depending on the nature of the speaker and the notoriety of the speaker. But we've had some really successful. We had a couple of webinars on epidemics, and we've had some experts who talked about the social history of pandemics and how people respond to them. We may do more of those. I think my sense is a lot of people are tired of hearing about COVID and want to hear about something else that's a little bit more positive and encouraging. So we're doing some of that too. We'll do some events on race relations, because that's obviously on everybody's mind right now. One thing that I should have mentioned is that in 2015, I believe, the Andrew Mellon Foundation gave us funding to bring in 2 Latino studies scholars. And that was a real shift for S.A.R. It's funny about it that in some ways the Hispanic and the Native have always been at some distance from each other, but I felt that it was time for that to change. And so we've had just some tremendous Latinx scholars come through. And I think they're mostly young, mostly likely to define the shape of Hispanic studies for the future. And that's been one of the things I'm personally most proud of.
And is that every year? There's a couple of
so we have 2. We have 1 designated Native American scholar position. We have 2 designated Latino studies positions, and then the rest are open. So, archaeology is still very well represented. We just had 2 archaeologists in the cohort of scholars that's just leading the campus. Patricia Crown from UNM, who's very well known, I'm sure known to you and many of your listeners, and Davina Two Bears is a Navajo archaeologist who's done some really interesting historical work in Dene country, and we'll have one archaeologist coming in the fall. So archaeology is still alive and well at S.A.R. It's funny, I sometimes get grumpy messages from longtime members saying, "You guys don't do archaeology anymore." And then the last time that came in, I listed the last 15 events that we've done related to Southwestern archaeology.
Right.
But a lot of it is just people aren't as aware of obviously the seminars are not typically, they don't have as much of a public dimension. And so even our members are not always aware about the seminars until the books come out, which is usually a couple of years later. But books have a huge impact.
Are you guys going to be doing anything special for virtual Indian market this year with?
Yeah, we are. We have a whole series of events to support SWAIA. And we're featuring, and again, this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse because I'm not a social media guy. I'm just enough of a geezer, or really I don't have the time to track that. But Felicia Garcia is our education curator, has launched a whole Instagram thing of interviewing some of our artists, especially the ones that are connected to SWIA and IAIA, and we're getting tremendous viewership on those events too. So they're much more informal, often done with a phone camera and so on, but they're absolutely charming, and audiences love them. So
And that's on your Instagram account?
yeah, and
you know the name of your Instagram?
I'm sorry, I don't. I should know
Probably
that.
something like S.A.R, I would imagine.
But you can find that on our website.
Yeah.
We find all the connections there. So we're busier now, I think, in some ways. I mean, we miss our members. S.A.R members are the, creative, quirky, cosmopolitan, and just tons of fun to see in person. And I personally miss that. And there is something about the energy. I mean, when Elizabeth Colbert, the Pulitzer winner, did our president's lecture 2 years ago in this Leipzig, we had over 700 people, and the energy is just fantastic, and she did a wonderful job. And we were supposed to have Robert Krulwich of NPR as our speaker in the spring. That had to get postponed to next May. I'm not even sure we're going to be able to have a crowd like that at next May, but so we'll have to figure out something. So we've had to work with online platforms. We get a somewhat different and much more international audience.
Yes, I would think. Well, you'll pick up some people just from this podcast. You're going to get different, unique people that you probably never had gotten before, and that's great.
So we're the one message that I've given to my staff is that we're going to try new things. I love the institution. I have tremendous respect for its historical legacy, but the world changes. I mean, this crisis that we're in is an example. If we just sat on our laurels and said, we'll wait till it's all over, we would die. I mean, not literally, but it just would be missing an opportunity. And so we're just sort of trying to, just like you are, we're trying to take advantage of the technologies to get our message out and to provide enriching opportunities for our members. And so far, I have to say, I think it's worked out better than we expected. It is true that my guest room now looks like a studio. I have a professional mic. I have some professional lighting. I had to get a new camera because my Mac was dated enough to. Our IT people said, "Michael, you look too fuzzy," and so we're working it as best we can, and people are responding wonderfully.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day, and I do understand, when you have a crisis like this, that you have to do a lot of. There's a lot more work than you can imagine. You would think, well, in my case, there's no clients walking in the door really. Well, that may be true, but we're doing all these other things that we, need to focus on content.
That's right.
I'm doing an online auction that's going to, be my first online auction. I've never done that before. So, you have to, this gives you the opportunity to look and try different things. Some will do well, maybe some won't. But
That's right.
Clearly, you're the right person at the helm of S.A.R. to get it through this process and make it better, literally. I mean, all that content
I hope so.
is for forever, right? All this great content that you're producing is going to be a library for the future.
Yeah, that's the hope, and my job right now is to create a platform so that whoever succeeds me can then take it to the next level. And I think, and have the kind of staff that can allow the next president to do that. I love the institution. It's been part of my professional life. The first event first time I came to S.A.R. was in 1983 for an advanced seminar on dreaming that Barbara Tedlock chaired, and that book is still in print and still sells copies, and I just was blown away by the campus, and obviously writing a book that for me was very formative, War of Shadows, because it was a different kind of writing. It's kind of like an adventure story as much as anything. That was, it was a huge impact, and we try, and many of the other scholars who followed me say the same thing, that it's just the opportunity to be in this beautiful place in the most interesting, well, with all due respect to Tucson, to be in the most interesting and beautiful part of the Southwest.
Right. I get it. I'm a New Mexican. I'm a native New Mexican, so I get it. Santa Fe is pretty special. This is going to be the first year I may not have been in Santa Fe for the summer in 30 plus years.
Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I'm in Arizona. They don't want me over there now. It's a 14-day guaranteed to come into your state, and I get it.
Yeah.
You're keeping the numbers.
No, it's a tough. As you know, we've got a good governor. She's been really tough. You know, she doesn't like the direction that the curve is going right now, but we're still in a better spot than some of our neighbors.
Yeah, all of your neighbors, pretty much.
Yeah.
On that happy note, well, we'll end it. I've got another one coming. One of your Dubin fellows is Mateo Romero is my next guest.
Yeah. Mateo will be great. He'll do
Yeah.
a fantastic job.
Your follow-up. So well, I'm
Okay.
doing a bunch this week. So this will be out for those who are for your knowledge. This will come out this next Wednesday. So
Okay, thank you very much. And just, I hope people, if they're engaged by this conversation, come to our website, sarweb.org, look at what we offer, sign on for some of these events. Some of them are free and open to the public with a voluntary donation. See if you like what's happening. And the ones we can really open up Indian Arts, the Indian Arts Research Center and that collection to the public again, we'll be back on track. That's the hardest thing, but we'll get there soon enough.
it's an amazing collection. I just, I love to get to go see it. It's awe-inspiring what you've been collected over.
I'm awed. I'm awed every time I go in there. I feel the same way.
Yeah. Well, there's an energy for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, when you walk into that vault, there's an energy of life, culture, of the hours that were made to put into these, and just artistic merit. Yeah, there's something there. Yeah, it definitely it's in the air there. That's it. We'll end it up on that.
Okay, we'll be taking. By the way, that collection will go on the road in 2022, opening at MIAC, the Museum of Indian Arts and Cultures in Santa Fe. We hope it will be on the road after that. We don't know where, but it's going to be 100 of the most amazing pots. Most of them from our collection, some of them from the Vilcek Foundation in New York, and they've acquired some truly dazzling specimens. So,
how about Tucson Museum of Art? We'd love to have that.
Oh, that's a possibility. And one of the things that's unique about it, it's going to be essentially curated by Pueblo people themselves, and all the captions, the object descriptions are written by individual Pueblo people. That's slowed down a bit because of because a number of the Pueblos are closed, so we can't get our consultants to the collection. But we're moving forward with that. And I think it's going to be truly awesome.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you, Michael, so much for spending.
Okay, my pleasure.
I'll see you in Santa Fe soon. I hope very soon.
I'll look forward to it. Stay well.
All right. Bye-bye. We need your support for the Medicine Man Gallery channel, so make sure to click the subscribe button and tap the little bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video, which we do every morning on Wednesday and Friday. See you soon.